Soundings Audiobooks presents an unabridged recording of Shadow of the Hangman, written by Edward Marston, read by Gordon Griffin. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Soundings, Whitley Bay, NE26 2JT. Chapter 1, 1815. Ned Greet was a short, slight, wiry man, with long, straggly hair and the face of a startled rabbit. He was also one of the most prolific and successful burglars in London. Confident that it would never be claimed, he'd watched with amusement as the reward for his capture increased steadily in value. Most criminals in his position would have decided to lie low for a while, but Greet was not going to let anything interfere with his lucrative occupation. Risk excited him. It made his blood race. As he set off into the cloying darkness of the capital that night, therefore, he was tingling with anticipatory joy. His target was a warehouse piled high with exotic spices. Even small quantities of them would fetch a high price. Before he tried to break into the building, he walked furtively around it to make sure that no night watchmen were on patrol. When he felt that it was safe to continue, Greet used a jemmy to prise open the window at the rear of the warehouse. Climbing in was the work of seconds. Once he was there, he lifted the shutter on his lantern and let its light spill out. Temptation was all around him. Taking a deep breath, he inhaled a dizzying compound of aromas. What he could smell was pure profit. Opening the large leather bag slung over his shoulder, he took out a handful of small canvas ones and began to fill each of them in turn from a different sack. Peppercorn, cassia, cinnamon, turmeric, cardamom, and other spices were carefully gathered, then placed into the leather bag. Absorbed in his work, Greet moved swiftly and deftly, assessing the value of his haul as he went along. He was in his element. Greet was only aware that he had company when he heard a voice behind him. "You won't need those in prison, Ned." The burglar swung round to face a tall, lean, well-dressed man in his 30s, whose handsome features were illumined by the lantern. Apparently unarmed, the newcomer seemed completely at ease. "Who are you?" demanded Greet. "I'm the person who will have the supreme pleasure of collecting the reward money for your arrest," said the other, raising his hat in a mock greeting. "I could have apprehended you earlier, of course, but I'm a patient fellow, so I waited until there was an appreciable sum on offer. Your career as a thief is decisively over, I'm afraid. You were too greedy, Ned, and that brought you to my attention." Greet was shocked. "You've been following me?" "Let's just say that I've been keeping a friendly eye on you." "But I always cover my tracks." "Watching you doing it has been a rare entertainment." Greet was cornered. He was shaken by the news that his escapades had been under scrutiny by someone else. He peered intently at the man. The stranger looked bigger and stronger than him, so Greet judged that he would come off worse in a fight. Instead, therefore, he snatched the dagger from his belt and lunged. But the man was far too quick for him, shooting out a hand and squeezing Greet's wrist so hard that he let out a cry of pain and dropped the weapon on the floor. The man kicked it out of reach. Releasing his hold, he clicked his tongue disapprovingly. "That was ill-advised, Ned. Try anything like that again," he warned, "and I'll be obliged to kill you, albeit with regret." Cowering before him and rubbing his wrist, Greet changed tack. "There's enough here for both of us, sir," he said, with an obsequious grin. "You can take your pick. I'll help you fill the bags. Choose wisely, and we can both get away with a small fortune. Spices are rich pickings." He added with a gesture that took in the whole warehouse. I know where to get the very best price for them." "That's of no consequence," said the man. "Don't you like money?" "Well, yes, I love it as much as anyone. But what I'd like even more is the satisfaction of seeing you behind bars in Newgate. You'll enjoy different odours there, I warrant. Some of the most pungent engendered by your own miserable body." Greet was indignant. "I don't belong in prison." "Then you shouldn't have taken up thievery." "I've a wife and family to support." "They must look elsewhere for sustenance." "Look," said the other, panic setting in. "I'll strike a bargain with you, sir. I'll steal nothing. I'll leave it all for you." "That's uncommonly generous of you," said the man, laughing. "But I spy a problem. These spices are not yours to give away so freely. Morally and legally, they belong to someone else." "They're yours for the taking." "The same is equally true of you." "No, no," said Greet, holding up both palms as his companion took a step towards him. "Consider this, sir. I can see by your appearance that you have an excellent tailor. Seize the spoils on offer here, and you can buy a dozen new suits from him in the latest fashion." "I have apparel enough to content me." Greet was dismayed. "Is there nothing that'll tempt you?" "I seek only your arrest." "Then we must part as enemies." The burglar was like lightning this time. Thrusting a hand into an open sack, he grabbed a fistful of pepper and threw it straight into the man's eyes, blinding him momentarily. Greet took to his heels, darting off into the gloom in search of escape. When he came to a staircase, he ran up it as fast as he could. The sound of the burglar's feet clacking on the wooden steps told the stranger exactly where his quarry had gone. With the lantern in his hand, he set off in pursuit. Finding the staircase, he began to ascend it, but he got only halfway up before he had a glimpse of a blurred figure ahead of him. Greet had a sack of flour over his shoulder, and he hurled it directly at the man, catching him in the chest, knocking the lantern from his grasp and sending him tumbling backwards down the steps. Having disabled his attacker, Greet elected to cut his losses and get out of the warehouse altogether. He blundered along the upper floor. When he reached the door through which goods were winched up from below, he flung it wide open and jumped into the darkness, landing with cat-like ease on the ground below. To his utter amazement, he heard a metallic click as the shutter of a lantern was lifted and a pool of light was created. Greet found himself staring at the person he thought he'd just knocked down the stairs. "That's impossible!" he howled. "You can't be in two places at once." The man beamed at him. "It appears that I can, Ned." Chapter 2. Gully Ackford handed over the money, then recorded the amount in his ledger. He was a big, well-built man in his 50s, with the weathered look of a veteran soldier. His craggy face wore its customary smile. "That's your share of the reward, Peter," he said. "By right, you should have had more, because you actually arrested Ned Greet. It was my brother who flushed him out of the warehouse. If anyone deserves a larger slice, it ought to be Paul. He still has bruises from the encounter. But let's not haggle over the takings," said Peter Skillen, pocketing his money. "Greet's arrest was the work of a team. You found out where the wretch lived, Jem trailed him for us, then Paul and I stepped in to catch him in the act." "I've watched Greet for a long time. He's like so many of his breed, a Tyburn blossom who was always going to end up as a gallows bird. He'll be dancing a jig for the hangman before too long." Peter was sympathetic. "I'd sooner the fellow were transported, Gully. No man should have his neck stretched for stealing a piece of ginger and a few cloves." "I disagree," said Ackford firmly. "You're too soft-hearted, Peter. Thieves are vermin. If they're not exterminated, they'll steal the clothes off our backs. Besides, he went on, Greet was not there for tiny samples. According to Paul, the villain grabbed enough in his grasping hands to set himself up as a spice merchant. His punishment will still be too great for the crime. Robbing the warehouse was only the latest of his offences. Ned Greet has been the busiest thief in London. We'll be applauded for netting the rogue at last, and a lot of his victims will be there to cheer at his execution. Instead of blaming the burglars, said Peter wryly, they should instead chide themselves for failing to protect their property with sufficient care. If people wish to keep thievery at bay, vigilance must be constant. Peter Skillen was a mirror image of his twin brother Paul. They were not simply identical in outward appearances. Their facial expressions and habitual gestures were also interchangeable. Their voices were so similar in timbre and pitch that even Gully Ackford, who'd known them for many years, sometimes had difficulty telling one from the other. What set them apart were profound differences of character. "What comes next?" said Peter. "Need you ask? What comes next is the joy of spending that money I've just given you. If you're short of ideas on how to do so, I dare say that Charlotte will provide some suggestions." Peter grinned. "My wife has a gift for shopping tirelessly, even if it's to buy things of which we have no need whatsoever." "Then give her free rein. When that bounty is fully spent, there'll be plenty more to make our purses bulge. As our fame spreads, commissions will begin to flood in. Banks are always in search of our talents, and there is unlimited work guarding the more fearful members of the aristocracy. We'll never starve, Peter." They were in one of the rooms at the rear of the shooting gallery owned by Ackford. Used by a variety of clients, it offered instruction in shooting, archery, fencing, and boxing. Ackford was an expert in all four disciplines. Among his most regular customers were the twin brothers, who liked to keep their fighting skills in good repair in case they were needed. As a young soldier, Ackford had tasted defeat at the hands of the American rebels at Yorktown. Against Napoleon's armies, by contrast, he'd savoured victory in a British uniform. Peter and Paul Skillen valued his experience. He was a demanding tutor, and a man with a rasping authority when it was necessary to impose his will. "What will your brother do with his share?" asked Ackford. "I dare say that Paul will spend every penny on some gambling haunt." "What if he wins at cards for a change?" "That's as likely as his finding the woman of his dreams." "But he already has found her. The trouble is that she married you instead." "Oh, I think he's outgrown that disappointment," said Peter with a smile. When Charlotte was no longer available, he quickly discovered willing substitutes, and has been working his way through them ever since. They change so fast that I can never remember their names. "Paul needs to settle down." "He has done so frequently, Gully, but never for very long." They shared a laugh. "Don't try to change my brother. That's beyond the capability of any man. It would be like telling the moon not to shine, or stopping the flow of the Thames. Paul is a force of nature. He'll go his own way, regardless." Paul Skillen looked through the front window, in time to see a figure hurtling towards the house. He identified Jem Huckvale by his speed, rather than by any physical features. Short, compact, and holding onto his hat with one hand, Huckvale was known for his prowess as an athlete and his skill at weaving through a crowd at full pelt. He would never walk if he could trot, and he would never do that if he could run flat out. When he reached the house, he paused to catch his breath, then rang the bell. A servant admitted him, then showed him into the drawing-room. "Come in, Jem," said Paul, embracing him warmly. I hope that you brought what I was expecting." "I have indeed," said the other, taking a fat purse from his coat pocket. "Gully has divided the reward, and I'm delivering your share." "Then you are doubly welcome. He sends his regards." Receiving the purse from him, Paul tipped its contents onto a table and spread out the banknotes and sovereigns. He lifted a handful of coins and feasted his gaze on them before letting them cascade down onto the pile. Huckvale, meanwhile, had removed his hat and stood waiting politely. As well as being Ackford's assistant at the shooting gallery, he was a trusted messenger with wings on his heels. Though he looked to be no more than 15, Huckvale was 10 years older, but the freshness of his face and his small physique disguised his true age. "This will help me pay off my debts," said Paul, counting the money. He looked up. "Has Gully given you your share?" "Yes, and it's far more than I deserve." "No modesty, Jem. You played your part as well as any of us. Once we'd found out where Ned Greet lived, you shadowed him for weeks. That was dangerous work, and should be recognised with payment." "It's a privilege to serve you and Peter," said Huckvale admiringly. "My needs are limited, and my wages at the shooting gallery are more than enough for me. Being able to work alongside you and your brother is the real recompense." "Thank you. There's always so much excitement." "Is that what you call it?" asked Paul with a hollow laugh. "There's no excitement in being knocked down a flight of stairs by a bag of flour, I assure you. It was a miracle that I came off with nothing worse than bruises." "We caught him. That's the main thing." "No, Jem. We made good money for doing so. That's what is really important." "Peter says that we're helping to cleanse the city of crime." Paul shrugged. "If my brother wants to view it as a moral crusade, so be it. I take a more practical view. Every time we deliver a villain to the magistrates, we get paid for our efforts, and that enables us to indulge ourselves. Peter, of course, has turned his back on the multiple pleasures of the capital, but I intend to enjoy them to the full, and that costs money. Unbeknownst to him, Ned Greet has both cleared my debts and supplied me with the requisite funds for gambling anew." "Greet has other things on his mind at the moment, Paul." "Yes, he's having nightmares about Tyburn." His harsh laughter echoed round the room. Like most people, Huckvale couldn't tell the twins apart simply by looking at them. It was only when they began to express a point of view that he saw how dissimilar they really were. Peter was calm, reasonable, and compassionate. His brother, on the other hand, was a man of trenchant opinions, reckless, irresponsible, and wayward in his private life. Huckvale was devoted to both of them, but, without really understanding why, the one he really idolized was Paul Skillen. "News of the arrest is in the newspapers," he said. Paul curled a lip. "I make a point of not reading them." "It's a way of building our reputation." "That will please Gully." "It pleases everyone who wishes to uphold the law." "I can think of a notable exception, Jem." "Oh? Who might that be, pray?" "I'm talking about the man who's been hunting Ned Greet as long as we have." "Micah Yeomans?" "He'll have seen the fellow as his legitimate prize. After all, Micah is a Bow Street runner. He thinks that gives him a monopoly on justice." "Our success will make him seethe," said Paul, with wicked satisfaction. "Micah Yeomans will be livid when he realizes that we are the best thief-catchers in England." "The scheming devils!" roared Yeomans, holding the newspaper with trembling hands. "The Skillen brothers have had the gall to do our job for us. They've caught Ned Greet." Scrunching up the newspaper, he flung it aside. "Why didn't we get to him first?" "We were too slow," said Alfred Hale. I blame you for that. I did my best. Patently, it was woefully inadequate, said Yeomans with withering scorn. We keep a whole army of informers. Why could none of them earn their money and tell us where Greet was hiding? They did earn their money, suggested Hale, and Ed paid them more to keep their mouths shut than we paid them to keep their eyes open. Then how did those loathsome twins manage to track him down? That's a secret I'd love to know, Micah. You failed me again, Alfred. You've no right to call yourself a runner. I strive to please. Ha! There are times when your incompetence disgusts me. Hale was about to point out that Yeomans had been equally incompetent when he remembered what happened when he last challenged the senior man. It was safer to accept the rebuke and lower his head to his chest. Nature had been unkind to Yeomans, giving him a face of unsurpassable ugliness, with a misshapen nose, competing for dominance against a pair of huge, angry green eyes, two monstrous, bushy eyebrows, and a long slit of a mouth, from which a row of yellow teeth protruded. Even in repose he looked grotesque. When roused, as he was now, Yeomans was positively fearsome. A former blacksmith, he was a big, hulking man with powerful fists that were well known in the criminal fraternity. Hale was a solid man of medium height, but he looked puny beside his companion. Both were in their 40s, with long, distinguished records as principal officers of Bow Street. They hated rivals. The Skillen brothers live off blood money, said Yeomans contemptuously. We've had our share of that in the past, Hale reminded him. Hold your tongue. It's true, Micah. We have legal authority. They are floundering amateurs. Then why do they always show us up by harvesting our crop? They've trespassed on our land far too long, said Yeomans through gritted teeth. It's time to teach them a lesson, Alfred. Nobody can steal from us with impunity, least of all that pair of popinjays. His eyes blazed. I want revenge. Chapter 3. O'Gara is behind this, said Shortland bitterly. We don't even know if he's still in the prison, sir. He's here, Lieutenant. I feel it. Then why have we never seen him? They're hiding him somewhere. O'Gara's been a confounded nuisance since he first arrived. He's always trying to stir them up to mutiny, and it looks as if he's finally succeeded. We should have locked him in the black hole and left him to rot. The men did have a legitimate grievance, argued Reed. The food contractor delivered a consignment of damaged hardtack that was almost inedible. That problem was solved yesterday, said Shortland curtly. Fresh bread was brought in. Unfortunately, it didn't satisfy this rabble. They're determined to cause trouble, and it's being orchestrated by Tom O'Gara. He's only one of thousands of prisoners, sir, so it's wrong to single him out. They all want the same thing. The war against the United States has ended. They're demanding release. We run this prison, Lieutenant, not a mob of American sailors. They were viewing the situation with increasing disquiet. Hundreds of prisoners were milling around the yard. The sense of resentment was tangible. Voices were raised, fists were bunched, and more prisoners joined the melee. Captain Thomas Shortland of the Royal Navy had been governor of Dartmoor for less than 2 years, and he hated the bleak, unforgiving, isolated prison. He was determined to exert control, but the strict discipline he imposed had only served to create anger and vocal resistance. It seemed now as if a full-scale riot was about to break out. A soldier came running breathlessly towards the governor. "They're hacking a hole through to the barrack yard, sir," he yelled. "I was right," decided Shortland. "It is a plot." He swung round to face Reed. "Ring the alarm bell, Lieutenant. Rouse the whole garrison." "There's more to report," gabbled the soldier, as Reed rushed off. "Someone has smashed a gate chain with an iron bar. Prisoners are flooding into the market square. They're ignoring all commands." "Then they'll have to be taught a lesson." Events moved swiftly. The alarm bell clanged, and the soldiers grabbed their muskets before running out of the barrack yard. Bayonets fixed and lines formed, they faced the horde of jeering prisoners. Shortland first tried to persuade the crowd to return to their quarters, but his voice went unheard in the pandemonium. He resorted instead to coercion and ordered a charge. Though hopelessly outnumbered, the soldiers surged across the yard, their gleaming bayonets driving many of the prisoners back. Those near the gate continued to taunt their guards, who responded by firing a volley over their heads. Enraged by the tactics, the prisoners fought back with ferocity, throwing stones, lumps of turf, and anything else they could lay their hands on. Battle had been joined. The next volley was aimed directly at the seething mass of prisoners, killing some outright and wounding many others. Retreating in panic, the men bumped into each other in a wild bid to escape. Muskets continued to fire, and more victims fell to the ground. It was a massacre. The yard was soon covered with bodies and stained with blood. Eventually the shooting stopped, and the hospital surgeon was able to rush forwards to examine the wounded. There were over 60 of them, some with serious injuries. 7 prisoners were already dead. Forced and frightened back into their quarters, the rest of the men were howling in protest. The tumult was deafening, and the sense of outrage was palpable. Horrified by what he'd seen, Lieutenant Reed sought out the governor. "There was no need to fire directly at them, sir," he complained. "They asked for it," said Shortland unrepentantly. "Oh, we'll have even more trouble from them now. They had to be reminded who was in charge, Lieutenant. We were up against an insurrection. Only force would quell it. We killed unarmed prisoners. It was done under severe provocation. This was an organized revolt. It had to be stopped in its tracks, and, God willing, there might be a bonus for us." Shortland smiled hopefully. "One of the dead men may turn out to be Tom O'Gara." Henry Addington, 1st Viscount Sidmouth, studied the report with unease. As Home Secretary, he did not have direct control over prisons, but since he was responsible for public safety and was the ultimate authority on the regulation of foreigners, an account of the Dartmoor riot had been sent to him. When he finished reading the document, he summoned Bernard Grocott, one of his under-secretaries. "There's been a mutiny at Dartmoor," he said. "Has it been suppressed?" "Yes, it has, but with dire consequences." He handed the report over. "See for yourself. It's dispiriting." Grocott nodded, then read the document with a searching eye. The elegant calligraphy yielded up a grim story, and he clicked his tongue in disapproval. He was a short, fleshy man in his 40s, with a mask of permanent anxiety etched into his face, his eyebrows raised in consternation. "This is disturbing intelligence, my lord. I'd like to know more detail." "There's detail enough for us to form a judgment." "That's my concern," said Sidmouth. "Any judgment would be premature. At the moment, we only have one side of the argument. Far be it for me to take up cudgels on behalf of American prisoners of war. But they must have had cause to rebel in the way that they apparently did." An image of George Washington popped up in the Under-Secretary's mind. "Americans are seasoned in rebellion, as we know to our cost." "That's a valid point. I'm tempted to say that it's in the nature of the beast." "There'll have to be a full investigation." "It's not the first trouble we've had in Dartmoor," said Grocott, putting the report back on the desk. "When thousands of French prisoners were held there, they were always voicing complaints. even though all kinds of concessions had been granted to them. They ran their own courts, meted out punishments, were allowed to buy food from the prison market, and had both a theatre and a gambling house to while away the time. Gambling was at the root of many of the disturbances there, said Sidmouth, and doubtless it still is. If men bet and lose their entire food rations, they are bound to become desperate. Then, of course, there's the prevalence of disease in that God-forsaken place on the moors. The mortality rate is shameful. Prisoners have tried to escape simply to stay alive. That doesn't make mutiny acceptable, my lord. Quite so, Grocott, quite so. But we have to allow for the fact that the men held there are under duress. French prisoners have money to soften the impact of the harsh conditions. The Americans, by and large, have none. They suffer. Now in his late 50s, Sidmouth was a tall, slim, dignified man, worn down by the constant pressure of affairs of state. 3 years as Prime Minister had been especially burdensome, winning him few friends and a legion of detractors. Yet he was a kind, tolerant, unfailingly courteous man, with greater abilities than his enemies recognized. By instinct, he was also scrupulously fair, and liked to weigh the evidence regarding a particular issue before reaching a conclusion. "I'd like to know more about this business," he said. "The war with the United States is, blessedly, finally over. These men should not be fretting away their days behind prison walls. They should be sailing back home." "The Peace of Ghent has been ratified," Grocott pointed out. "What is holding them up is the lack of transport. The sooner they are shipped out, the sooner we shall stop having alarming reports from Dartmoor." "It's a place of unrelieved misery," his companion grimaced. "It was ever thus, my lord." "What do you mean?" "I mean that the Home Office is principally the recipient of unending bad news." He struck a pose. "After a long war, Britain is in a parlous state. We have a gigantic national debt, falling revenue, a disordered currency, chronic unemployment, and whole sections of our population are on the brink of rebellion. Only yesterday, for instance, we heard of more violence in factories, where new machinery has been installed and secret societies are being formed with the sole purpose of undermining the government. On whom are these problems dropped? It is always us." "You are right," agreed Sidmouth sadly. "Almost all the troubles of the nation are dumped on us. I own that there are times when I feel that the Home Office is nothing but a glorified waste-paper basket, into which every other department of government can throw its unwanted litter. We are truly beleaguered." He sat back wearily, then remembered something. "Talking of waste-paper baskets, I couldn't help noticing that mine has not been emptied today. We've all suffered that inconvenience, my lord. What happened to our necessary woman? She appears to have been lax in her duties. That's highly uncharacteristic of Horner. Someone must tax her. When one is the nation's largest waste-paper basket," he went on, with a rare attempt at humour, "one does at least expect to be emptied on a daily basis." Tom O'Gara was still furious about what had happened at Dartmoor. When the soldiers had fired their first murderous volley, he'd seen defenceless comrades fall to the ground. Unlike most of the prisoners, O'Gara had not fled back to his quarters. He and his friend Moses Dagg had taken advantage of the confusion to climb a picket fence, find a hiding place behind the hospital, and stay there until nightfall. Under cover of darkness, they'd made their way to the military walk, a gap between the high, concentric stone walls that encircled the prison, and bided their time until the sentries on the wooden platforms went past. Then they clambered up the steps to the top of the perimeter wall. After dropping to the ground beyond, they'd run as if the hounds of hell were baying at their heels. The next couple of days were spent dodging the search parties who'd come out looking for them.
"They'll never get me back inside that place,"
vowed O'Gara.
"Nor me,"
said Dag.
"It ought to be burnt to the ground, and Captain Shortland with it. I'd enjoy dancing round the blaze. So would I, Moses."
O'Gara was a sturdy Irish-American, in his late 20s, with a mop of dark hair and a fringe beard. He rubbed his face, arms and hands liberally with dirt, so that he would be concealed in the part of the prison where the black sailors had been segregated. One of them, Moses Dag, had been his shipmate when their vessel was captured. Both had been kept in custody in Plymouth before being transferred to Dartmoor. Conditions had been so appalling there that O'Gara acted as a spokesman for the other prisoners, voicing his demands with such insistence that he aroused the ire of the governor. Instead of winning concessions, therefore, O'Gara was promptly sent off to the Black Hole, a punishment cell made entirely of stone blocks. There was no natural light, and only a tiny grill for ventilation. O'Gara was forced to sleep on the bare floor. The sparse rations were poked in through an aperture in the reinforced metal door. Though the maximum sentence was 10 days in the Black Hole, the vindictive governor kept him in there for a fortnight. Instead of breaking his spirit, however, all that Captain Shortland did was to strengthen O'Gara's will to resist.
"Someone should be told the truth,"
said Dag.
"They will be. But who will listen to us? We'll have to make them listen, Moses. How do we do that? First of all, we have to get well clear of Devon,"
said O'Gara.
"We'll have to steal to eat here. The best place for food and protection is London. I've a cousin there who'll take us in." "He may take you in, Tom. But do I look like an Irishman?" "Yes. I'll tell them you're a lad from Killarney who caught too much sun."
Dag shook with mirth and punched his friend playfully on the shoulder. Adversity had deepened the bonds between them. Dag was a solid young man, with bulging muscles and a ready grin. When O'Gara's persistent protests had aroused the governor's ire, he put himself in grave danger. He became Shortland's scapegoat and was blamed for every sign of unrest. Dag had sheltered his friend in the segregated area and thereby saved his life.
"Well," said Dag, chuckling, "if you can be a black man, then I can be an Irish leprechaun. How do we get to London, Tom?" "We'll do what we know best." "And what's that? We're sailors, aren't we?" "Yes, we are." "Then let's get afloat. When we reach the coast, we'll steal a boat and plot a course to London. Once we have a refuge, we can tell the truth about Dartmoor." "Who will we speak to?" "Well, it won't be the transport office," said O'Gara vehemently. "They're supposed to look after prisoners of war. But they answer to the British Admiralty. And we've seen the way they treat us." "Yes. They put that monster Shortland in charge of Dartmoor. We'd never get fair treatment from the Royal Navy. So, we'll have to go above their heads. We've got a tale to tell, Moses, and we must tell it loud and clear. The person who really needs to hear it is the Prime Minister himself."
Chapter 4. After a busy morning teaching the noble art of self-defence to a couple of young blades, Gully Ackford adjourned to the room at the rear of the shooting gallery and sat down gratefully behind the desk. Within minutes, there was a respectful tap on the door, and then it opened, so that Jem Huckvale could usher a stranger into the room before slipping out again. The newcomer was a stout, pale-faced individual of middle years, with an air of prosperity about him. He introduced himself as Everett Hobday. "I need your help, Mr. Ackford." "With respect, sir," said Ackford, noting the man's paunch, "you are not exactly built for the boxing ring.
It would be folly on my part to attempt to persuade you otherwise. I take it, therefore, that you seek instruction of another kind. I've come to engage the services of your detectives. Ah, I see. I read the newspaper report of their latest success and decided that they are the men for me. I want the best, and I'm prepared to pay accordingly. How can we be of assistance to you?
Hobday explained that he was leaving London the following day and was taking the servants to his country residence. The last time he did that, his townhouse in Mayfair had been burgled. He needed someone to look after it while he was away. His request was not unusual. Peter and Paul Skillen had acted as night watchmen before, in some of the more opulent houses. The difference this time was that their payment would be unduly generous. Hobday was well-spoken and plausible. As proof of his honesty, he offered an appreciable deposit.
Then I gratefully accept it, sir, said Ackford, taking the money. Though one question, I have to confess, does remain. What is it? Why not leave a servant at the house? It would be a much cheaper solution. A servant would know the property well, whereas my men do not. I tried that once before, said Hobday with a sigh, and it ended in disaster. The servant, whom I left alone to guard the house, was surprised by the burglars and given the beating of his life. I could never subject an employee of mine to that fate again. This is a task for experienced men like yours. Since they were trained by you, they will be proficient in the use of arms. They are proficient in everything, I do assure you.
That is the very reason which brought me here.
How long will you be away, sir?